This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Seminar 6, Lectures 13 to 19. In the last few videos, we've considered dreams from two case studies, both dealing with a dead father, one of whom appears to the subject in a dream, the father who did not know he was already dead, as the son wished, the other one who leaves his son with these words, "Robert must take my place." This time, we move into a fictional character, perhaps the most renowned in all of English literature, Hamlet, which also concerns a dead father, but one who knows he's dead and who reveals the truth of his death to his son. For Lacan, this play and its central protagonist offer us critical insights into the tragic dimension of desire. As a fictional character, Hamlet embodies all the problems between subjectivity and desire, both in its obsessional and hysterical configurations, a quality much more challenging to observe in actual individuals. Lacan writes, "People have said that Hamlet's desire is an hysteric's desire. This is perhaps quite true. Other people have said that it is an obsessive's desire. In truth, Hamlet is both. He is purely and simply the place of desire. Hamlet is not a clinical case. Hamlet is, if you will, a sort of hub where a desire is situated, and we can find all the features of desire in him." A critical question governing Lacan's exploration of the play is this: why is it so difficult for Hamlet to take action? When he seems to have every reason to do so, why does he continuously procrastinate avenging his father's death by killing his murderer, Claudius? Addressing such a question will entail considering the structural features of the play. And unsurprisingly, such a consideration will be made through the graph of desire used throughout this seminar and the previous one. Rather than summarize the play for those unfamiliar with it, I'll present those elements of the drama as they relate to the unfolding of Lacan's argument throughout these 7 lectures, which is that the play is a work about mourning, and that it teaches us about the tragic dimension of desire, which, according to Lacan, entails the encounter with death, both the death of the other as well as one's own. A final comment before we begin. Among all the sections of Lacan's seminars I've discussed so far, these 7 lectures are among the clearest in explaining the meaning of the terms that make up the graph of desire. Perhaps the clarity of this section is due to the fact that we're dealing with a familiar text, Hamlet, rather than a clinical case summary wherein we get second or third-hand information. This certainly helps a great deal. Additionally, though, Lacan seems much more deliberate in defining his terms, articulating their significance far more explicitly than I've seen him do up to this point. So if you're looking for a place to possibly get started in understanding the graph of desire, these 7 lectures might be a good place to look, especially if you're familiar with the play Hamlet. Now let us more precisely formulate the problem that Hamlet presents to us. Lacan calls Hamlet the procrastination play par excellence, as the play concerns Hamlet's relationship with the need to take action. The action Hamlet is procrastinating is avenging his father's death by killing Claudius, Hamlet's uncle and brother of his father, who married Hamlet's mother very quickly after his father's death. He learns of the circumstances surrounding his father's death from his father's ghost, who informs Hamlet that he was murdered in a state of unrepentant sin, which means that he's either suffering the purifying fires of purgatory or the eternal flames of hell. The ghost commands Hamlet to avenge him by killing Claudius. Hamlet desires to do the father's will out of a respect and love for this father, whom Hamlet idealizes. But there are other layers to Hamlet's desire, and once we begin to think in Freudian terms, we'll quickly consider his desire for his mother and the desire to keep her for himself, possessing that which is the maternal object, by killing its possessor, Claudius. So at this point, it would seem that both desires, a desire to do his father's will and a desire for his mother, are quite aligned. Both point toward killing Claudius. But then, why is Hamlet procrastinating when he's got every reason pointing toward the same action? It's not some moral quandary, since within the logic of the play, Hamlet is fully justified in taking this action in the name of justice. He's also clearly capable of taking decisive action in other regards, such as his premeditated delivery of his two false friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to their deaths. One interpretation, the one we find promoted by Freud in the interpretation of dreams, is that Hamlet cannot act on the one who is the possessor of the maternal object because Hamlet has, in fantasy, already committed the crime for which he is seeking revenge. Thus, he cannot attack Claudius without symbolically attacking himself, and without awakening in himself an ancient desire for which he feels guilty, that he wished for his father's death out of a desire for his mother. As such, according to this interpretation, there's a close link between Claudius's death and his own death. And it's not until at the end of the play, when Hamlet has been already given a fatal blow, that he can finally act. And my apologies for giving no spoiler alert in case you didn't already know that. Lacan does seem to affirm this interpretation somewhat, but it doesn't fully capture the situation. The unique interpretation Lacan offers is that Hamlet's desire is far from his own, that we're not merely dealing with Hamlet's desire for his mother, but also the desire of his mother, as it shapes his own desire. And to understand how this can be the case, we need to now explore the structural situation of the play as it's framed in terms of the graph of desire. Lacan uses the closet scene in the play to illustrate what is happening at the lower level of the graph. The scene occurs in the mother's private chamber and is marked by an intense emotional exchange between them. Hamlet confronts his mother about her marriage to Claudius, accusing her of betraying his dead father. His aggressive approach to his mother leads her to cry out for help, at which point Polonius, chief counselor to King Claudius and father of Laertes and Ophelia, whom we'll discuss soon, responds from his hiding place behind a curtain, prompting Hamlet to stab through the curtain, mistakenly killing Polonius, whom he thought might be Claudius. Following this, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears only to Hamlet, reminding him about his mission to kill Claudius and not harm his mother. While appearing sort of crazy to his mother for responding to this ghost that the mother is not seeing, Hamlet then implores his mother to repent and avoid Claudius's bed. Lacan adds that toward the end of the scene, Hamlet ultimately backs down from his demand, though this appears to be a misreading of what Hamlet says. And if anything, Hamlet appears resolute in his demand to the end of the scene. I'll bracket the question concerning the accuracy of Lacan's reading here to focus on the implications of that interpretation for the theoretical approach that Lacan is employing. So thinking about this scene in terms of the graph, as a first step, we can represent Hamlet's demand on the line of articulation, also called the line of intentionality or demand's intention. This line intersects with the signifying chain at point A to give rise to speech. Whenever a subject speaks, it always does so with borrowed signifiers, which alter demand in ways that make it alienated, changing the very nature of the demand and leaving something unsaid by the subject. Point A is a locus or anchoring point that makes the formulation of speech obey specific laws, not merely those of grammar, but also those of a social order. For this reason, point A is considered where the big other gets instantiated. And the meaning of the intention of demand is also shaped by this speech, unfolding at the level of the other. Whenever we make a demand, the response to our demand retroactively shapes that demand's meaning. For this reason, the message is identified here as the signified of the other. In the case of Hamlet, the intention of demand meets up with a mother whose desire is enigmatic to Hamlet. How can she not distinguish between an idealized, exalted object, the father, and a disparaged object worthy of scorn, Claudius? According to Lacan, Hamlet presumes some insatiability within the mother that prevents her from making such a distinction. Hence, he tries to instruct her how to desire differently and refrain from spending one night with Claudius so that each subsequent night will become easier. We can see in the scene that instead of merely focusing on how to exact revenge on Claudius, Hamlet is seemingly distracted by another matter, his mother's desire. Lacan writes, "We cannot fail to realize that what Hamlet is constantly dealing or grappling with is a desire far from his own. As it is situated in the play, it is the desire not for his mother, but of the mother. That is, it is his mother's desire. That alone is what is at work." So we can perhaps see how Lacan is subtly shifting the focus from a traditional Oedipal interpretation, where Hamlet's desire for his mother is central, to an understanding of how his mother's own desire figures centrally in Hamlet's conflicted will. It's for this reason, according to Lacan's questionable account of what happens at the end of the scene, that Hamlet ultimately backs down from his demand. He lacks conviction because his will to act is in conflict with his own enigmatic desire, preventing Hamlet from choosing between his idealized dead father and the scornful object Claudius, as his enigmatic desire itself is a reflection of his mother's enigmatic desire, leading the subject to ask, "What do you want?" which Lacan also formulates as, "Who is it that is speaking? What have I become in relation to this alienated demand?" Lacan indicates that the question itself is raised at the level of consciousness, and we encounter it anytime we're confused by our own actions or when we encounter doubt toward our own speech. This is a question that goes beyond the subject of the statement, the one that is included in the speech that says, "I want you to stop what you're doing," and instead concerns the subject of the enunciation, the I that is giving rise to the formulation of the demand in the first place, the unconscious subject, and not the subject that I typically identify with, the ego. The question itself entails going beyond this first encounter with the big other, in search of a truth beyond this other, a truth that can resolve the question of what the other is to me and what I have become to myself. It is a fundamental inquiry into the other's desire, as our own desire is conditioned by it, a grappling with one's position in relation to the other's desire. In contending with this question, the subject must come to terms with their relationship to demand and what shapes it. Our demands, despite their variation, have a certain consistency and structure about them, a regulating law that conditions their formation. The question then reflects the subject's attempt to understand and position themselves within this enigmatic desire in light of an internalized demand emanating from a law, which is thought here as a superego commandment. So when Hamlet makes his demand of his mother, he does so in the name of the father, whose ghost issues the imperative, "Remember me," placing Hamlet in a position of obligation to fulfill the father's demand to avenge him. So what is represented in this position is the bard subject in relation to demand. The symbol of the bard subject refers to a subject who has been irreducibly affected by the signifier, since to express a demand is to do so through signifiers that come from the other, and thus induce a split in the subject between the subject that is spoken of and the subject that speaks, since the unconscious demand prohibits certain signifiers from being said while allowing others to be spoken. Bringing this back to Hamlet, when Hamlet articulates his demand to his mother, he is doing so in a manner that is not with his own will, but that of his father's. And yet that articulation of demand is also coming into conflict with another demand, one that he's experiencing through his mother, which impacts his ability to persevere in his own demand, ultimately backing down. And when Hamlet does back down, this leads to a discourse that drops back down to the other's message the signified of the other, where we find the mother's desire dictating the meaning of Hamlet's speech. In other words, Hamlet cannot sustain his father's will in the discourse. What would it mean to continue to go beyond this discourse for the other, beyond the line of demand, beyond the mother as other, to sustain the question concerning desire, something that Hamlet doesn't do here? It would entail going further with the question, asking, on what basis is the ghost's commandment valid? What justifies the truth not only of the mother's desire, but also the truth about this truth insofar as it is thought to be founded upon the father? This leads us to the next point on the graph, the unconscious message, as it's called here. Lacan calls this point the truth about truth, where we encounter the tragic kernel of the play, the traumatizing moment that disorganizes Hamlet's psychic economy. Now, how so? The symbol for this point reads, the signifier of the barred other. The barred other means that there is a lack at the level of the other, and as such, the other cannot provide any definitive answer to the question concerning desire. What does this lack in the other represent in the play? And what are the implications of this lack in general? In the play, the dead father's message reveals to Hamlet that the woman Hamlet has loved before he can remember, the woman who is supposed to be the very reference point and locus of truth for Hamlet, is in fact incapable of discerning the difference between a worthy and unworthy object, an object who is revealed to be a betrayer. And to the degree his mother has participated in this matter, she is also a betrayer. This revelation takes Hamlet's legs out from under him. He has, psychically speaking, lost that which provided a firm foundation upon which he could structure his subjectivity with a certain consistency. This is a tragic dimension that begins the play, and the consequence unfolds throughout. But this lack in the mother is met with a more fundamental lack in the father, whose very appearance as a ghost communicates this lack, which does not merely concern desire, but also concerns a lack of power and authority. For the father is incapable of doing anything, and was even killed in a state of sin, suggesting that he was already lacking something before he died. And then there's Claudius, who is now king, but an illegitimate symbol of that authority. So what are the broader implications of saying the other is barred or lacking? Lacan states, this is the big secret of psychoanalysis, if I may say so myself. The big secret is that there is no other of the other. So there's no guarantee of truth which refers to the truth of desire. No one and nothing can provide the answer to the question, what do you want? What do I want? Because the very one who is the source of my desire, the one I desire, but also the one whose desire is my desire, is incomplete, castrated, if you will. You might be wondering to yourself, didn't Lacan mention in Seminar 5 of there being the other of the other? So what gives here? And looking back at that seminar, we can perhaps see that these expressions are not so contradictory. In Seminar 5, the other of the other refers to the law that governs the other, a law that the mother is beholden to, the law of the father, a law that the child imagines as depriving the mother. But this is a foundation that the subject presupposes in the other. In pushing past this, past the barred subject in relation to demand, the subject will discover that even the law has no basis, that there is no truth about truth. Let me take a more relatable example, perhaps, to make sense of this. When a client comes to see me in my role as a licensed clinical psychologist, my position vis-a-vis them as an authoritative professional is established in part by how the client sees me as vested by a set of credentials that provides some sort of guarantee that I have a certain kind of definite answer. However, it would completely change the situation if it was revealed to that client, say by the licensing board, that I was disbarred for malpractice, that my license was taken away from me because I did not believe in or adhere to the board standards. But it could equally be disturbing to discover that the very credentialing board by which I gained my semblance of authority was in some way illegitimate, that its own authority lacked any foundation that could guarantee that my authority means anything. In the case of Hamlet, he seems to be hit with both realizations at the same time. Both his mother and father are barred. The answer from the father is this: not only can you not count on your mother, but dear old dad is dead and in hell. Much of the play that follows this revelation from the ghosts represents Hamlet's neurotic defense against this realization, giving rise to the symptomatic expression of his procrastination. While in the circuit of desire, one arrives at desire through encountering the lack in the other, Lacan sketches the unfolding of the closet scene in terms of a bypassing of this signifier of the barred other. Hamlet is not yet ready to recognize and confront this lack, and the symptomatic consequence is his indecisiveness and procrastination, his intellectualization at the cost of action. Now, what is this S, the signifier, missing in the other? And if it's not in the other, where is it? The signifier of lack is what Lacan names the phallus. And the phallus is the answer to the question, what do you want? I want the phallus. And see it in the other, but discover that the other does not have it. All this sounds fairly vague. Fortunately, Lacan provides further clarity on the matter. He says that the phallus symbolizes the life unavailable in the subject. The subject is looking for this life, and the only reply the other can give is this signifier of lack, because the other doesn't have this life either. This life we are speaking about refers to some part of the subject that's been sacrificed as a price paid for becoming a subject in the first place. And this is what is most threatening to the subject, as it undermines the very possibility of wholeness that is pursued on the imaginary plane. So where does one turn to locate this desire if not in the other? Lacan notes that it is somewhere between the two discourses, between the discourse for the other on the line of demand that is the lower signifying chain, and the discourse of the other, the upper line that comprises the unconscious signifying chain wherein we find the father's demand. Between these two lines, we may locate desire. That desire is not locatable in itself, though, but only in terms of something that sustains and structures that desire, that being unconscious fantasy. Fantasy is inscribed at the end of the subject's question, filling in the non-answer provided by the other, who fashions a signifier of lack. The formula for fantasy represents, as it did for the unconscious code, the subject irreducibly affected by the signifier, as that signifier places the subject in a specific relationship with an object. If the phallus symbolizes the life sacrificed by a human being becoming a subject, the object takes the place of the phallus as a prop for the subject who lacks this phallus, a substitute for what has been lost. Lacan spends a good deal of space attempting to specify the nature of this peculiar object and how it functions differently than what we ordinarily think of as an object, including the imaginary object that would take place at the lower level of the graph. The object of fantasy is not the object of desire, but Lacan says the object in desire. The object in desire occurs at the level of the unconscious, and whose value is in generating the subject's desire rather than signaling its satisfaction. By taking the place of that element the subject has sacrificed in one's relationship to the signifier. Stated another way, to the degree we've undergone castration, deprived of something of fundamental value, a sense of wholeness or completeness in being subjected to an alienating social order for the sake of acquiring some kind of socio-symbolic meaning in life, that sacrifice something that is part of us, the pound of flesh, as Lacan calls it, incarnates itself in a desubjectivized form that serves to regulate and fixate desire in a highly specific manner. Lacan states, the formula signifies the following. A specific object becomes an object of desire insofar as the subject is deprived of something of himself that has taken on the value of the very signifier of his alienation. Lacan states that fantasy is part of an unconscious circuit articulated through a signifying chain different from the line of demand. However, in situations that Lacan calls atypical, which we see in Hamlet in relationship to Ophelia, as we'll soon see, there is some aspect of fantasy that reaches down below of the graph at the level of the message, the signified of the other, which is most clearly manifest in perversion and more indirectly in neurosis. So in perversion, the imaginary element of the object tends to overshadow the subject, and those imaginary elements become highly concretized, locatable in space and lying outside of time. This mention of time may not make sense until we consider how much time plays a role in the subject's relationship to this object in neurosis. So in neurosis, the emphasis is placed on the barred subject rather than the object. That is, rather than a relentless pursuit of the object, the neurotic adopts a strategy that deals with the fundamental incompleteness of the subject in the context of an object that is always at some other place and some other time. In being marked by time, the object takes on a signification where it's always an hour ahead of schedule or an hour behind. The neurotic subject always waits to find this moment of the object. So, and this whole waiting is the foundation of the neurotic behavior that we see in general, whether maybe it's through repetition or procrastination, with the hysteric staging scenarios that provoke the other into responding to the question concerning desire, but in a manner that never satisfies, and with the obsessional seeking to delay the confrontation with the answer to the question of desire by negating the other's lack and thus one's own. As noted at the beginning of this video, what makes Hamlet such an exceptional character study is that he embodies most features of neurosis. Like the hysteric, his desire is highly dependent on the other's desire, the mother. Like the obsessional, he continuously puts off taking action in the direction of his desire. Whenever Hamlet does act, it is always precipitated by factors outside of his control, leading him to constantly operate on the other's time. It's owing to his parents that he does not head to Wittenberg, to Claudius's plan that he departs for England, to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's mission that he is led to send them to their deaths. All this leads Lacan to say, we have here a true phenomenology of the life of the neurotic. So how does unconscious fantasy function in Hamlet? Lacan is quite clear that Ophelia is the barometer for Hamlet's position with regard to desire, and that the shifting manner in which Hamlet relates to Ophelia communicates his own psychic progression. The relationship between Ophelia and Hamlet evolves over 3 stages throughout the play, stages framed in terms of Hamlet's relationship with his object, and which appear to correspond in some ways to the 3 registers of the imaginary, real, and symbolic. After encountering the ghost for the first time, we enter stage 1, estrangement. Hamlet becomes increasingly erratic and harsh in his behavior toward Ophelia, distancing and devaluing her from her prior position as an idealized object. Lacan calls this moment strictly pathological, as something in fantasy enters into what was a relationship that took place initially on the imaginary plane. This happens when something in the imaginary structure of fantasy establishes a communication pathway with what typically reaches the level of the message, that being the other's image, which we can perhaps think of here as the manifestation of symptoms. Why does this estrangement happen? To the degree the object embodies the sacrifice part of the subject, the part the subject lacks. To distance himself from Ophelia is his way of distancing himself from his own desire. The traumatic encounter with the father's ghost disturbs any previous psychic equilibrium Hamlet had, which was perhaps already made fragile in mourning the death of his father prior to the revelation. Consequently, Hamlet wishes to distance himself from his desire, which Ophelia stands in for and can awaken within him. Stage 2 is when Ophelia becomes the phallus. To be the phallus here is to become a signifying symbol of that life the subject has sacrificed, which in this case appears in the real as an externalized, rejected object. Lacan notes how Ophelia's name may even have an etymological link with the phallus, but more convincingly, the evidence lies in the way Hamlet begins to talk about Ophelia in terms of fertility and in making lewd jokes about her sexuality, such as when he places his head between her legs and asks her, "Shall I lie in your lap?" suggesting that it is Ophelia who has the phallus. What does it mean for Ophelia to represent the phallus, and how is this different from her identification as the object of fantasy? The object is a response to lack, delivering a promise of desire's fulfillment while sustaining desire. The phallus is a signifier of the lack itself, the impossibility of fulfilling desire. Ophelia's identification with the phallus here is a natural continuation of the estrangement of stage 1. In distancing himself from Ophelia, he rejects his own desire, which she represents for him, rendering Ophelia the very symbol of this rejection of desire, in which she comes to embody what Hamlet cannot possess or control. Stage 3 entails the reintegration of the object, which occurs following her death, perhaps due to suicide, becoming an impossible object whereby she once again resumes full value for him. What facilitates this transformation? In the graveyard scene, as the gravediggers work to bury Ophelia, Hamlet enters the scene, not yet realizing that it is Ophelia who's died. He then observes Laertes, her brother, being visibly distraught and arguing with the priest about the limited rights given to Ophelia due to the suspicion of suicide. Overcome with grief, Laertes leaps into his sister's grave, wishing to be buried with her. At this moment, Hamlet realizes that it is Ophelia who's died. He reveals himself and jumps into the grave as well, declaring his love for Ophelia and challenging Laertes' grief by claiming that his love, Hamlet's, for her surpasses that of 40,000 brothers. Laertes plays an essential function as a foil to Hamlet. While Hamlet is characterized by his introspection and hesitation, Laertes acts swiftly and without much contemplation when seeking revenge for his own father's murder. As such, he serves as Hamlet's ideal ego. This mirror relationship evokes a kind of aggressiveness in Hamlet and a willingness to act that up to this point had been missing in him. It's also the case that beholding Laertes' grief serves as an image of loss that spurs Hamlet into the intensity of his own grief, allowing him to re-inhabit his own being and resume the desire he was seeking to flee from. And no longer needing to flee from his own desire, Ophelia can then resume the position of the object of fantasy for Hamlet that sustains his desire. What is it about Laertes' grief that allows the imaginary identification with him to affect the constellation of Hamlet's symbolic world? To answer this question, we have to take up another question. What is mourning? We have heard that the play Hamlet is a work of mourning. Hamlet mourns the loss of his father, and then mourns the loss of Ophelia. Lacan provides some powerful insights into how mourning functions here. He tells us that mourning involves a truly intolerable loss that constitutes a whole in reality. This whole provides a place onto which the missing signifier is then projected, the signifier whose absence renders the other unable to provide definitive answers. However, there's an essential difference between the two losses in this play. Rather than mourning necessarily, it is melancholia that Hamlet experiences following the death of his father and subsequent revelation as a ghost. Melancholia is characterized as a pathological response to loss, wherein the subject cannot properly symbolize this absence in the real. Confronted with such radical loss, rogue representations from the imaginary begin to proliferate, and it begins to look a lot like a psychotic process wherein the lost object leaves a haunting presence, manifesting in the very appearance of the ghost and the subsequent madness that Hamlet appears to feign to disguise his motives in the play and in order to manipulate others, but perhaps was a madness he genuinely descended into. And it would seem that Lacan would lean toward that latter interpretation. In contrast, the second loss, that of Ophelia, appears to reflect a process of genuine mourning. Unlike melancholia, mourning allows the loss to be symbolized. First, Hamlet publicly declares his sorrow and love for Ophelia. He articulates the loss in speech, transforming it into a symbolic process. And rather than lose his own identity, for the first time in the play, he openly declares it, exclaiming, "This is I, Hamlet the Dane." At the same time, all ambivalence toward Ophelia evaporates, and the living object of desire he took distance from turns into a lost object that he now mourns and can reintegrate as an idealized object. In Ophelia assuming the position of impossible object, Hamlet is able to more fully assume his castration, and thus more fully assume his desire and symbolic identity, which now emboldens his will to take the action he is committed to. However, even then, it's not until he has himself been mortally wounded, representing his full confrontation with death and his own inescapable castration, that he is able to take the final blow that will kill Claudius. He moves beyond the intellectualization of the problem of death, to be or not to be, and assumes his being in facing his own non-being. What are the implications of this in general for us? For Lacan, there is an original mourning that we all must endure, related to a fundamental loss that we all have to come to terms with after having grown weary of continuously seeking a gratification or trying to become what we think we need to be to obtain a gratification that never comes. That search for completeness is illusory. Mourning this realization is what it means to come to terms with one's castration, as it is a symbolic acceptance of loss and recognizing that something has been permanently taken away, but a loss that can be externalized and symbolized in a manner that allows an alternative kind of satisfaction, the kind that we can achieve through acquiring a meaning around this loss, a situating loss within a rich tapestry of a symbolic world. Indeed, one understanding of religion is precisely this, that despite sometimes ultimately ending up as a neurotic defense against lack, it often begins in the recognition that we are condemned to death and that we are fundamentally lacking beings. The greatness of the play Hamlet is to reveal to its readers this tragic dimension of our desire, that most of our behavior serves as a defense against the truth of our desire, that negative truth that there is no truth to our desire. It is left to the subject to confront this lack and make something of it in a manner that does not flee from it. A famous line in this play is that brevity is the soul of wit. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take up that advice, and I'm pretty sure even after I edit this video that it will be a fairly long video, but it was really important to get at this analysis comprehensively and not in a piecemeal fashion. So I hope it works in the way it is presented. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And if you like this video and want to support it, you can do so in a variety of ways: sharing it, subscribing, liking the video itself. And if you want to support this work financially, you can do so through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube down below. And I have a Patreon page where you can sign up for a tier where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. And I'd like to thank the following for already being supporters over on Patreon. Next time we'll move into a section called The Dialectic of Desire. Until then, thank you for watching. Be well.